Does everyone have source sheet and a seat? There's some seats here in the front. Okay. I'm Yael Ziegler. Welcome to Matan. Me'inyan le'inyan. We're going to be talking about Mashiach. I think we're all a little struggling to talk about, what are we talking about on Hoshana Rabbah? So Racheli spoke directly about what Hoshana Rabbah is about. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're going to do tomorrow in our tefillah, in Shacharit of Hoshana Rabbah. And I brought for you, even here at the top of the source sheet, a little bit of the tefillah that we're going to say tomorrow morning as we complete the Hoshanot. We have the special tefillah of Kol-Hamevasser, Mevasser ve'omer, right? And I called our shiur tonight Kol-Hamevasser. It's called Mevasser, but we have also Hamevasser, right? The Herald, stirrings of Mashiach. The tefillah of Kol-Hamevasser, which I was looking at, and I brought part of it for you here, really weaves in all of these psukim that allude to the period of Mashiach, right? The Messianic era. What is it going to be? And so tomorrow, as we complete the Hoshana, right, we're asking God, Moshiach, right, to save us and to bring salvation and to bring the end of days and to bring Mashiach, some kind of ideal period for Am Yisrael. What does that entail, right? What do we have here? Which psukim are woven into this tefillah? So I highlighted several of the psukim. We're not going to read the whole thing, right? But the beginning here, we have, I'm just reading from the end of the lines, the parts that are bolded. Actually, I'm not sure if you can actually see what's bolded. But the first line, Kol Dodi Hinei Zeba, the voice of my beloved is coming, right? We have this tefillah for the Shekhinah, for God's presence to return to us. Kol Dodi Hinei Zeba. We have a tefillah that God should specifically come back to Har HaZeitim, back to Yerushalayim, la'abod al Har HaZeitim. That's what we have there in the second line, right? We are davening for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to come back to Am Yisrael. We're davening for God to stand on Har HaZeitim. Let's not forget that on his way out of Yerushalayim to Galut in Sefer Yechezkel, right? We have also the Shekhinah on Har HaZeitim, right, on the way out, and now we're asking God to come back to be hovering once again over Yerushalayim. Skip down to line number 7, right, the end of the line. We daven for the rebirth of a dormant and exiled nation. Noldu ki yeled mimei imo. We want Am Yisrael to be reborn again. Mi shama kazot umi ra'a ka'ela. Do you see where I'm reading from? I'm just reading from the ends of the lines. We daven for divinely wrought events that astonish the world. Mi shama kazot. This is a quote from a pasuk in Yeshayahu at the very end of Yeshayahu Parak Salavav. These are all psukim, right? They're all weaving in these ideas into the tefillah from psukim. We daven, of course, for kibbutz galiot. Look down 2 lines. Kichala gam yaldat Tzion, right? Tzion is going to conceive. Tzion is going to give birth. Harchivi mekom ohalech. This is also a pasuk from Yeshayahu, right? It's one of the Sheva Denechemta that we read quite recently, right? We say to Yerushalayim, widen your tent, right? Widen it. Why? Look at the next line. Kabli v'nayach uvnotayach. Right? Why do you have to widen the tent? Because you have to receive all of these exiles that are coming back, all of the children that are returning to Yerushalayim. And then, of course, we have the final part of this tefillah, is a prayer for the restoration of the Davidic dynasty, right? Called Semach Ish Semach Shmo Hu David Be'atzmo, and we conclude the final 3 lines with a pasuk that is pretty well known, right, from Tehillim, but also from Shmuel Bet, Migdol Yishot Mako Oseh Chesed V'Mshicho LeDavid U'Lezaro Ad Olam. So what are we davening for here on Hoshana Rabbah as this intense and wonderful period of both tshuva, both repentance and the chagim begins to come to its finale, right? We are davening, we're hoping, we're praying, and we're considering the possibility of this imminent movement towards an ideal end of days, right? A time when God returns his Shekhinah to Yerushalayim, a time of renewed closeness with God, a time of the return of Am Yisrael to Yerushalayim, the growth of Yerushalayim, a renewal of the Jewish people who will once again work together in order to spread the light of God to the world. Now that's what we're davening for tomorrow, and that's somewhat of a summation of what it is that we're looking for in the ideal end of days. Now, in tonight's class, I'm going to sort of use this as an opportunity to talk about the idea of Geula, the idea of Mashiach, the idea of what is that ideal end of days, what is Geula, specifically in Tanakh, right? We are looking, or I want to be looking towards the Tanakh to see how the Tanakh envisions Geula, how the Tanakh envisions the process towards Geula, and of course, the ultimate aspiration, right? What is the result? What are we looking for ultimately for Geula to be? And one of the reasons that I want to address this is because I think that sometimes when we think about Geula, we envision something that is kind of outside of reality, right? Is Geula some kind of perfect time period, perhaps where one day, unexpectedly and out of the blue, everything will fall neatly into place and Yerushalayim Shel Mala will come down, right? Will descend from the heavens with the Mikdash at its center, right? Perhaps even more fantastically, is Geula a time when all humans will be at peace with each other, right? Pretty fantastic. When the whole world will serve God, when, listen to this one, a perfect leader will emerge from the woodwork who will achieve common consensus because of his virtue. Can you imagine? I think maybe we can imagine it. We hope that we can imagine it. But is that what we're looking for? Is that what the Tanakh is envisioning? And perhaps most unlikely of all, are we looking towards a time when human beings will shed all of their human failings and foibles and weaknesses and become idealized versions of themselves? In other words, will we stop being human, right? Is that these are questions that I think that are important questions. They're interesting questions. How does the Tanakh present Geula, the end of days? What are we looking towards? Are we looking towards some kind of, really significant change in the world? And how do we prepare for that? And what is the process that is meant to move us towards that? Now, I will say that when I say the Tanakh, there's lots of different prakim in the Tanakh. There's lots of different Nevi'im, there's lots of different prophets, there's lots of different chapters, and certainly the Tanakh does offer some rather eschatological prophecies that offer the possibility of a world of changed humans and changed nature and a rather perfected existence. I'm thinking of Yeshayahu Perek Yud Aleph for one, right? If you look at the 11th chapter of Yeshayahu, where he envisions this, this choter migezeh Yishai, this sprout that's going to come out of the trunk of the Davidic dynasty, of Nachalav Ruach Hashem, Ruach Yirah, Ruach Chokhmah, right? He's going to have all of the great milas that we could imagine that a leader will have. And, the lion will lie down with the lamb. And, again, the machloket between the Rambam and the Ramban, if that's a metaphor, right, for world peace, which is itself, I think, rather incredible, or if it's really talking about the changed nature of animals. We're going to get into that right now. But, I want to really actually address something a lot more specific than these kind of fantastic chapters, which I love. I mean, Yeshayahu Yud Aleph is one of the great prakim in Tanakh. It's very, I think, beautiful and uplifting and inspiring to read it and to hope for it and to hold it up as an ideal. But what I want to actually look at with you tonight is the one period in the Tanakh where it seems that the messianic future is in our sights, right? Where it seems that Geula, that possible end of days, actually can become a reality. And that is a period of Shivat Zion, right? And it's actually quite a messy period, but it's one that has high hopes and great potential. And many of the Nevi'im are going to approach this period, we're going to see some of this tonight, to approach this period as a period which is meant to lead us to some kind of end of days, a messianic period. Again, I'm using different terminology. Messianic period literally means a period with a great leader at its helm. That actually doesn't really happen. Well, arguably doesn't really happen in Shivat Zion, but it could have happened in Shivat Zion. So I want to look a little bit about at how the different prophets that prepare us for this period, how they view this period, what are the ideal aspirations for Shivat Zion, what is it meant to look like, how do we prepare ourselves for this process of bringing Shivat Zion to fruition, to its greatest potential. And then, of course, talk a little bit about what actually does happen during Shivat Zion and what can we learn from that? What are the struggles and the setbacks and the difficulties and the ultimate failure of Shivat Zion? Because whatever else you want to say about Shivat Zion, it doesn't bring out the end of days, right? It doesn't bring out a messianic period. It is a period with, I think, certain accomplishments, and I want to try to talk about what those accomplishments are at the end. But more importantly, what are the lessons that we're meant to draw from Shivat Zion in our hopes that we will once again have that opportunity to bring about the messianic period, the end of days period. So I'll just say a couple very brief points that will offer a little bit of a historic context for Shivat Zion. Of course, Shivat Zion emerges on the backdrop of Korban, right, on the backdrop of destruction, the destruction of Yerushalayim, the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, which takes place in 586 BCE. It is a devastating loss. And the bulk of the bulk of Yehudah goes to Babel, right? I mean, we've already lost the Israelite kingdom, 150 years earlier. And almost the entire exile ends up in Babel. And that's why it's so significant that less than 50 years later, and that point has to be kind of stressed, in 539 BCE, the Persian Median king, Cyrus, right, Koresh, proclaims that everybody, not just Yehudah, but everybody can go back to the land and rebuild their temples. Right? That's Hatarat Koresh. That's the proclamation of Koresh, which allows the people, the Jews in exile, to go back to the land of Israel and rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. Now, what happens is that in the wake of that proclamation, a few people go back, right? A few people go back. 42,360 people go back. Okay, so some people go back with Shesh Batzar, right? They have a leader. He kind of disappears, that leader, Shesh Batzar. We don't hear much about him afterwards. But there is an initial movement back to the land of Israel, and pretty much right away they lay the foundations of the temple, of the Mikdash, right? That's what they do. They say, okay, we're going to build a Mizbeach, and we're going to start building the Mikdash. And of course, there are troubling, there's some troublemakers around them who prevent them from building the Mikdash at that time. The next period of Shivat Zion, which I think is very significant, is the period of Chagai and Zechariah. We are going to talk a little bit about Chagai and Zechariah. Those are probably two of the most successful Nevi'im in all of Tanakh, right? And they prophesy 19 years after Hatzarat Koresh. They begin their prophecies. They prophesy for a very short period of time. They begin their prophecies in 520 BCE, right, in the second year of Dariavesh, and their whole goal is to get the people to build the Beit HaMikdash. And guess what? They're successful, right? The people built the Beit HaMikdash. In 516, exactly 70 years after its destruction, the Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt. And credit is given, actually very explicitly, Ezra in Parakeh, in the 5th chapter of the book of Ezra. Ezra gives credit to Chagai and Zechariah. He says, because of them, the people rallied together and they built the Beit HaMikdash. And there's great excitement, there's great fanfare, there's lots of celebration. There's a Simcha Gedolah Me'od. I think it's the only place in Tanakh where we have a Simcha Gedolah Me'od, a very, very joyous occasion. That's the second stage of Shivat Zion. The third stage of Shivat Zion is Ezra and Nehemiah. They're not there when the Beit HaMikdash is being rebuilt. They only come to the land of Israel Ezra in 458 and Nehemiah several years later. And this is, I guess you'd call it the third wave of Aliyah, right? Where Ezra and Nehemiah come. And Ezra and Nehemiah basically bring two kind of additions. They add two things to the spirit of Shivat Zion. Ezra, particularly, also a little bit Nehemiah, but Ezra in particular is very interested in religious reform. The people have fallen into a very sinful state. Intermarriage is a very big problem. I know that sounds shocking. That is actually one of the big themes of Ezra and Nehemiah. And Nehemiah is particularly concerned with rebuilding the walls of Yerushalayim and repopulating Yerushalayim. Which again, when you get to Nehemiah, which is, let's say, 440 something BCE, right? Yerushalayim is a mess, right? Yerushalayim, nobody wants to live in Yerushalayim. It's extremely dangerous. It is extremely vulnerable. There are a lot of enemies, right? Security is terrible, okay? So if some of this sounds, familiar, I mean, not now, but, let's say, the beginnings of this return to the land of Israel, it's fraught with difficulties, right? So we have these three stages, and in each stage, there are enemies that hamper the aspirations, but there's a lot of hope. There's a lot of potential. It's a period of return. It's a period of renewal, right? And this period, of course, it follows a period of devastation, right? Of terrible, unprecedented destruction. So for all of those reasons, I think this period is really a period that reverberates with the hopes that we're looking towards Geulah. We're looking towards God's salvation. Incredible things are happening, and yet it's also a little bit elusive, right? So we'll talk about that shortly. Now, I want to open with a prophecy of Haggai. For two reasons, I want to open with a prophecy of Haggai. Well, three reasons, really. One is because he's the main prophet of this time period, right? But secondly, because Haggai actually, who's really, it's a really short book. It's only 2 prakim long. He doesn't really, his main message is really it's kind of small, right? He says, okay, go build the Beit HaMikdash. And people say, well, we don't really have the money to build the Beit HaMikdash. Like, we're kind of suffering economically. And he says, okay, so go to that hill over there and cut down a tree and bring it here, and we'll build the Beit HaMikdash. It doesn't have to be, some fancy building in the beginning. It's pretty, I think, pretty common things. He's not asking them to do something really astounding. But then he gets 4 prophecies, Haggai, on different days, right? Each one is dated. Everything's very clear in terms of when it takes place. His second prophecy that he gets is a more dramatic prophecy. The first one is just go up to the hill and bring a tree, right? And the second one that he gets, and then God promises economic revival. If you build the Beit HaMikdash, things will get better. You're saying I can't build the Beit HaMikdash because I'm in terrible economic straits, and I'm telling you, you want to emerge from those terrible economic straits, you have to build the Beit HaMikdash, right? But in his second prophecy, he really offers a much more exciting kind of prospect, and that's the second reason that I want to start with Haggai. The third reason we're going to see as soon as we start reading Haggai. Let's look at what Haggai says. This is everything, as I said, everything is dated very carefully. This is the second prophecy that he gets. B'shvi'i, ב-21 לחודש, היה דבר השם ביד חגי הנביא לאמור. Anyone want to do those calculations? That's today, right? Then, Racheli was saying, well, we're looking for the beginnings of Hoshana Rabbah, and really, we don't have it in Tanakh, right? Hoshana Rabbah isn't really a day in Tanakh that is marked with the same way that most of our Chagim are. This is like a little hint, right? It's really the only, I think, major reference to Hoshana Rabbah. It's not called Hoshana Rabbah. There's no Petek, right? There's no Yom Hadin But there's this kind of stories of Mashiach that we have here. There's this message that Haggai is going to get out of Hoshana Rabbah, I think does have to somehow kind of penetrate some of our explorations of what this day is. And maybe even links up with our tefillah tomorrow, right? So tomorrow we're going to dive in for, some kind of really dramatic transformation for the Jewish people. And that's the message that Haggai gets on Hoshana Rabbah. I will say one other thing, and that is that his first prophecy was a little over a month before this, okay? And in that prophecy, when he tells them, just, go start bringing the trees, they've been kind of preparing for laying the foundations of the Mikdash for the past month. So they're busily bringing the materials to Har Habayit. They don't actually start building the building until when? Do you remember? Erev Hanukkah, right? Erev Hanukkah. Kaf Daled Kislev. That's when, or Kaf Hey Kislev is when they lay the foundation. Kaf Daled Kislev is the day that Haggai gives them his third prophecy, right? Which is tomorrow you're going to start laying the foundation. So, sometimes we say, oh, Hanukkah is not the Tanakh either. You have to just look at Haggai. Okay? Haggai seems to have all these kind of hidden dates here. But in this case, the message that he gets is a message of dramatic transformation. So let's look at Haggai, Parak Bet, Pasuk Bet, and more about El Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel Pachat Yehuda ben Yehoshua ben Yotzedek HaKohen HaGadol, El She'erita Am Lemor. By this time already, we have these two great leaders. Maybe we'll have occasion to mention them a little bit afterwards, right? He says, speak to the leaders, speak to the political leaders, speak to the Kohen, the priestly leader, and speak to the people, and say to them as follows: Mi bachem hanishar asher ra'at habayit hazeh bechvodo harishon, u'ma b'chvodo ata, halo chamo ke'ayim beinechem. Who amongst you saw the original Mikdash? And it has to be pretty old at this point to see the original Mikdash. And what are you seeing today? Kind of looks like nothing, right? Again, he's the one who told them, just bring a tree, right? And so they gathered a lot of trees. And he says, I know you're looking at this and saying, what are we doing, right? We remember, and even if we don't remember it with our eyes, we know what our elders told us. What kind of Geulah is this? Ve'ata, says Haggai, Chazak Zerubbabel Hashem, Ve'chazak Yehoshua ben Yotzedek HaKohen HaGadol, Ve'chazak Oram Haaretz Neum Hashem, Ve'asu ki ani itchem Neum Hashem mitzvot. Strengthen yourselves, everyone, because I am with you, says God. Et hadavar asher karati itchem v'tzeitchem mitzrayim v'ruchi omedet b'tochem al tira'u. Right, the same thing that I promised you, and the same brief that I made with you when you came out of Egypt, and I told you I'm going to be with you. Don't be afraid. In just a little bit of time, I'm going to shake up the world, the heaven and the earth, the dry land and the sea. Here, right? It's often the case in prophetic literature that there's a natural event that mirrors a political event, right? So that's what he's describing here, right? I'm going to shake up the world, and I'm also going to cause a tremendous shakeup in the world order among the nations. So you know what's going to happen, says Haggai? All of the nations are going to come here bringing wealth. They're all going to come, and I'm going to fill this house, this Mikdash, with glory. Look at Pasuk Chet. How can God do that? Everything belongs to me. I can decide where it goes. The second Mikdash, its glory, it's going to be even greater than the first. Right? I'm gonna put peace in this place. So this is really a pretty remarkable vision, right? It's a vision of peace. It's a vision of the whole world recognizing God. It's a vision of this temple becoming even more glorious than the first one. And this is stirrings of Mashiach, right? That's the Haggai part in here. Now, part of the problem, and it's one of the problems that all of the Parshanim are going to have to deal with is, did this actually happen in Bayit Sheni? So some of the Parshanim are going to say, well, Hashmonaim died, Herod, right? There's different possible periods that you could sort of, pinpoint, say maybe then, right? And some of the Parshanim are going to say, no, this didn't happen, right? It could have happened, it may have happened, it should have happened, but it actually didn't happen. We're gonna come back to that question at the conclusion of our shiur when we do discuss some of the disappointments of this period. It is a period that's filled with disillusionment and setbacks, and it does seem to fail to live up to this prophecy, but also its potential and the prospects that many of the different Nevi'im seem to give, right? Seem to see in this period. It does fail to really live up to that. And that's why I really wanted to start with Chaggai, right? Because I think right away we sense that there's kind of a disconnect between what the prophets are saying this period will be, should be, and what winds up happening. But there are really many different prophecies that seem to prepare us for the period of Shivat Zion, not just prophecies, but also I think many of the Mizrahi describe this period, right? Just think of Kuf Kavav, right? Yeshuv Hashem et Zion Hayinu Kechomim, right? Shir Hamalot, right? We all know that one pretty well. But Chaggai and Zechariah, Malachi, right? Also is probably a later prophet. Chazal actually identified Malachi as Ezra, or one opinion in Chazal. And he does seem to be later in this period, a lot later than than Chaggai and Zechariah, and probably contemporary with Ezra and Nehemiah. We're not going to talk much about Malachi, but actually surprisingly, and we're going to see this tonight, I think the prophet that describes the period of Shivat Zion and prepares us for the period of Shivat Zion in the most detailed manner is not Chaggai and not Zechariah, but actually Yeshayahu, which seems pretty surprising because we all know that Yeshayahu ben Amos is a prophet from the mid-8th century BCE, from the time of Uzziah, Yotam, Achaz, Chizkiyahu, Malchei Yehuda, right, from 750 to 700 BCE, which is a good 200 years before this period. So how do we understand that? Well, some of you may be familiar with the Pirkei Nechama, right? The final 27 chapters in Yeshayahu, which are actually talking about a totally different time period than the first 39 chapters of Yeshayahu. The first 39 chapters of Yeshayahu are talking about the mid-8th century BC. We're talking about Yeshayahu's time. The final 27 chapters of Yeshayahu are talking about Shivat Zion. It is absolutely explicit, right? It's the prophet saying to the people, Tze'u Bavel, right? Leave Bavel and go home, because I am going to rebuild Yerushalayim, whose Mikdash has been destroyed, right? It doesn't get more specific than that. And for anybody who's still kind of skeptical, because it is kind of an odd movement for 200 years ahead, but for anyone who's skeptical, all you have to do is look in Yeshayahu, Perek Mem Daled, and Perek Mem Hey, where Yeshayahu talks about Koresh, right? That's the only named person in those 27 chapters. So we are talking about the period of Shivat Zion. That's why these are Pirkei Nechama. These are chapters of consolation. Consolation for who? Right? The chapters start out Nachamu, Nachamu, Amin, right? Comfort, comfort, console my people. Why do people need consolation? Because they're in Galut. And they have very recently suffered a cataclysmic event, a terrible devastation, one that was unprecedented and one which they didn't actually know how they were going to recover from. Right? Exile, the destruction, the terrible loss of the Mikdash, the sense that they had lost God's presence among them, that God had hidden his face. There's so many aspects of that destruction that Am Yisrael has to contend with. And so when Yeshayahu opens these prakim, which are explicitly directed to the Jews living in Bavel during this period of exile, he opens with the words, Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami, Yomar Elokechem. God has said it's time to console the people. And in what way are we going to console the people? We're going to console them by telling them that I'm about to bring good tidings to you. I'm about to bring a period of renewal, a period of return, a period which is the possibility of the end of days, a period of Geulah and Yeshua, of redemption. And actually, these chapters of consolation in Yeshayahu, 27 chapters long, open with a mevasser. Okay, so let's look inside. Look in source number 2. This is Yeshayahu Perek Mem, which opens Al Har Gvoa. Well, it doesn't open. This is Pasuk 10, right? Al Har Gvoa Alilach Mevaseret Zion. Right, go up, the one who is the herald, the announcer of Zion. Go up to a very high mountain. Harini v'koach kolech mevaseret Yerushalayim. Lift up your voice with strength, you herald of Yerushalayim. Harini, lift up your voice. Al tirai, do not be afraid. Why is the herald afraid? Right, we might come back to that later. Imriva arei Yehuda, say to the cities of Yehuda, Hinei Elohechem. Here is your God. Right? God is now returning to Zion. Hinei Hashem Elokim b'chazak yavo uzro moshlalo. Hinei scharo ito v'lato l'fanav. God is coming back with strength. God's zroa, remember that zroa netuyah, right? That yad chazaka and zroa netuyah. He now is coming back with a strong arm. And what is he doing with the strong arm? Look in Pasuk Aleph. Hiro'eh edro, like a shepherd of his flocks. Bizro'o yikabetz pla'im uvecheko yisa olot uvecheko yisa alot yinahel. What is God doing as he's coming back? He's gathering up his flock. He's holding them in his bosom. He's carrying the weaker members of the flock back to Israel. Okay, so that's the herald. That's the mevasser. The mevasser is coming and he's shouting on the hilltops. Hinei Elokechem. Here is your God. Now, both the Barbanel in source number 3 and the Sforno in source number 4 say something very similar on this pasuk, right? Barbanel says, what is the herald coming to say? Just look at the last few words. Tavol vaser et Zion Yerushalayim b'geulatam. Right? He's coming to tell Zion and Yerushalayim the time of redemption has come. Sforno says it even more in sort of our terminology, right? Right? The Mashiach is coming. Again, I'm not sure I love that terminology. I'll explain. We often talk about Mashiach, right? But that's not the way that these prophecies are going to talk about this time period. It's a time of Geulah. It's a time of God coming. It's a time of Yeshua. It's a time of God's appearance in the world. The Mashiach is a great leader, right? But he actually is not very highlighted in this time period for various reasons. Partially, I think, because he actually doesn't seem to be. We don't actually have a leader like that in Shivat Zion. The closest leader to that is Zerubbabel, and he doesn't ever really. Okay, sorry, Zoom. Okay. Okay, so in source number 5, in Yeshayahu Perek Nun Bet, again we have the Mevasser. Here's a lot more developed. So let's see what it says here. Ma navu al harim raglei Mevasser. How beautiful on the mountains. Again, we have the Mevasser, the herald at the tops of the mountains. He wants to be heard. He wants to be seen. He wants to proclaim this widely, right? We see the legs of the herald, right? He's running. He's skipping over these mountains. Mashmiya shalom. He's letting people hear about the peace. Mevasser tov. He's announcing good. Mashmiya Yeshua. He is letting people hear of the upcoming salvation. Omer Litzion Malach Elohayich. Right? This is the king here. The king in this section of Yeshayahu is not the Davidic king, right? It's God, right? He is saying to Zion, God has been crowned, right? God has been made king. Kol Tzofayach Nasu Kol, right? The sound of Tzofayach, your visionaries, right? Your prophets has lifted up their voice. Yachdav Yiranenu, together, all these prophets, they're singing Ki ayin be'ayin yir'u b'shuv Hashem Tzion, right? They see eye to eye, right? With Radak says, with God. This is the restoration of Nivu'ah. This is why Reb Kook, as part of the return to Israel, believed in the restoration of prophecy because of this pasuk, right? Because the prophets are walking around feeling God's presence once again. Ayin be'ayin yir'u b'shuv Hashem Tzion. When they see that God has returned Am Yisrael to Tzion, they recognize God's palpable presence and they seek to renew communication between humans and God. Pitzchu burst out. Ranenu yachdav korvot Yerushalayim. Sing out together, ruins of Yerushalayim. Ki nicham Hashem amo. God has consoled his nation. Ga'al Yerushalayim. He has redeemed Yerushalayim. Chasaf Hashem et zera kodsho. God has revealed his holy arm le'enei kol hagoyim, in front of all the nations. V'ra'u kol hafsei aretz et yeshuat Elohim. All of the corners of the earth see God's salvation. So we have. This is quite a task, right? The earlier Mevasser just had to say, Hinei Elokechem, right? He just had to say, God's coming. This one, I think, gives a much more elaborate description of what it means, this period, right? And what does it mean? It means Tov, it means Shalom, it means Yeshua, it means Malach Elohayich, right? It means peace and good and salvation and God's kingship. Malbim, in source number 6, really explains that the Mevasser here comes to prepare us for a series of events. These events, of course, leading, as we said before, to this period of salvation. Look at what Malbim says. Manavu mitzayer ki Mevasser yalal roshei ha'arim. You see where I am? I'm in source number 6. Kamosha katuv, right? So we see almost this very pictorial image of the herald going up to the mountains. Look at line number 2 on the word number 2. The first thing he's going to tell us is there's going to be peace from the enemies. Afterwards, he's going to talk about good. That's the building of the Beit HaMikdash and the Matzmiach Keren David, right? The Tzemach David Avdacha Mehera Tatzmiach. Right, the renewal of the Davidic dynasty, which, as I said, is rather muted in Yeshayahu, but the Malbim says that that's what the Mevasser means when he talks about Tov, and afterwards he's going to give tidings of salvation. What is that for Malbim? Kibbutz Galiyot, right? The salvation is the bringing back all the exiles. Omer L'Tzion Malach Elohayim. Right? The ultimate kind of aspiration, the end game is that he's going to say to Zion, your God is king. Hu hitgalut malchut shamayim b'chol haaretz u'b'chol ha'amin. What is that? What does it mean to coronate God? Right? That is the revelation of God in all the world. Right? So that part of this salvation, part of the idea of Geulah, is that everyone will look around and say, Mi ra'aka mi shamaka. Who imagined that this could happen? This is a nation that just less than 50 years ago was a desiccated nation. This was a nation that had collapsed in despair with their capital city and their mikdash, and then they were scattered. Who could imagine that this would happen? If this feels a little bit like I'm talking about our century, that's okay also, right? I mean, again, I think so much of what is happening in Shivat Zion does, I think, make us sit up and take notice, and I think that's important, right? When we do learn Tanakh, we do want to be looking for relevant messages and lessons that we want to be also incorporating. Okay, so the Malbim talks about this kind of series of events. One interesting question is the identity of this Mevasser. Who's the Mevasser? Who's going to the tops of the mountains and shouting things from the rooftops? Well, one possibility is just a metaphor, right? It doesn't have to be actually a person, right? It's to spread this widely, right? But the Parshanim actually go in two basic directions here. One I brought for you with Rabbi Eliezer of Bugensi. Rashi says something similar, but he says it much more succinctly. Mevaser Tzion, Klomar Nevi'ei Tzion v'Yerushalayim. That's the job of the Nevi'im, right? That's the job of the Nevi'im. The Nevi'im are the Mevasrim. We have to pay attention to the Nevi'im, right? Which again, it's not so easy for Am Yisrael. As I said, Chagai and Zechariah, they seem to have been rather successful Nevi'im. They're also saying things that are more palatable, maybe than others. But you know what? Yeshayahu is going to have in his Perkei Nechama a really hard time. He's going to have a really hard time, and that's, I think, wherein lies maybe some of the problems of Shivat Zion. Abarbanel adds in source number 8 adds a second possibility, and he takes this from several midrashim say this. Look at the end of the Abarbanel, the end of the second line, the Chachamim zal drashuhu al Eliyahu hanavi sheyavo kodem hatshua v'yivasren. Right? We have this notion that Eliyahu didn't die, that he was kind of spirited away to some kind of afterlife. And he still has a job to do, right? That notion, of course, is partially supported by the fact that he writes a letter after he dies. It's called a Michtav Me Eliyahu. That is not Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler's letter, right? That's the actual Eliyahu's letter. Appears in Divrei Yamim. A letter arrives after his death, which suggests that he's still functioning at full capacity. But of course, the real reason, or the main reason that we assume that Eliyahu is the Mevasser is because at the very end of the book of Malachi, we end with this idea of Hinei Anochi Sholeach Lachem et Iryah Hanavi Lifnei Bo Yom Hashem Hagadol v'Hanora v'Yishiv Levavot Banim Lebanim, right? The whole Eliyahu piece at the very end of Nevuah. It's in the wrong place, but we'll get to that in a few minutes, right? Because really, we expect it to be here at the beginning of Shivat Zion, not the end of Shivat Zion, right? So some of the midrashim want to suggest that this herald is Eliyahu, and others say no, it's just the Nevi'im. Why does Am Yisrael need a herald at all? That's a really good question, right? Why do we need a herald? I mean, if the events are Geulah, then they're Geulah, right? So we should all know how to respond without a herald. And I think that already is the question that is leading us to see where things begin to go wrong. It turns out that Geulah is not so easy to identify, okay? It's not so easy to identify Geulah. It's much easier to identify Chorban, right? That we can pretty much put our finger on. But is this the Geulah? Is Shivat Zion the Geulah? When Cyrus, a pagan king, proclaims that Am Yisrael can have their kelim back and go back to the land of Israel and rebuild the temple, is that Geulah? Right? How do we know? Right, so we need that herald, right? And I think it's one of the major things that we're going to see during Shivat Zion is that it's not so easy to respond to Geulah, right? It has to come from us, right? We have to take an active part, as opposed to, again, Korban, which is done to us, right? And whether we like it or not, Geulah, we have to become active participants in Geulah, right? And that apparently is not so. I think we always think, I certainly thought this when I was younger, right? We always think that like, oh, if Geulah would happen, sure, I have my packed suitcase waiting to go, right? Or that's the famous story told about lots of Chachamim, right? They have the suitcase in the closet, and the Mevasser comes and says, Geulah is here, and I just pick up my suitcase and I get on my donkey or my plane and go to Israel, right? I remember. I think that part of this goes back to what we were saying before, which is, this idea of what is Geulah? How do we picture it? Is it some kind of Yerushalayim Shalmala descending into our lives and kind of like neatly and dramatically transforming the world? If it's that, I can identify it. But what if it's not that? Right? I remember many, many years ago when I was in Mechala, I remember one day, the sky turned orange. Now, I've been living in Israel long enough to know that happens about once a year, right? The sky turns orange. There's some kind of chamsin coming. You know what I'm talking about, right? So a chamsin coming up from Egypt, and the sky turned orange, and everybody says, "Oh, wow, that's really remarkable," right? But I remember one of the teachers, who must have been a newbie, said, "Oh, I think Mashiach is coming," right? And sent everybody out of the classroom and to prepare for Mashiach. I don't know exactly what that meant, but it was, again, there was a certain, I think, I liked that kind of vigor, that enthusiasm that we're looking for. We're waiting for it to happen, right? But what if the sky doesn't turn orange, or what if the sky turning orange is just a chamsin, right? How do we then identify Geulah, right? That the messy reality of Shivat Zion is that Geulah lacks clarity. Okay, and I think that is partially that's why we need the Mevasser. Shivat Zion unfolds naturally, right? Events move forward and events move backward, right? Nothing happens without our enemies coming and trying to thwart it from happening, right? I mean, that's the story of the first attempt to build the Beit HaMikdash. The second attempt to build the Beit HaMikdash, look at Ezra Perek Dalet, and Nehemiah's attempt to rebuild Yerushalayim with the walls. It's all filled with enemies and dangers and setbacks. But before we get there, we're going to talk about the setbacks too. Before we get there, I want to look at some of the prophecies and see how Shivat Zion really is envisioned by the Shivat Zion prophets. What are the steps, right? So we've already seen that Yeshayahu opens really by describing God returning to Yerushalayim. Look in source number 9. Zechariah also describes this. He describes it several times. Look in Zechariah, Perachet, Kol Shem Shafti al Tzion v'shachanti b'toch Yerushalayim. I've returned to Tzion. I'm living in Yerushalayim again, right? That idea that Geulah is about God's Shekhinah returning, that's all over the place, right? We even saw kind of a hint to it in Chagai, right? Ani itchem, right? Ruchachi is with you, right? My ruach is with you. This idea, I think, is a really important idea because of one of the things I alluded to before, which is that when Yechezkel describes the imminent destruction of Yerushalayim, he describes the Shekhinah leaving, right? The famous Maaseh Merkava, which we're also wowed by, is actually the beginning of the movement of God out of the land of Israel. He's on wheels, right? This throne is taking him out of the land of Israel. And so the beginning of Geulah is God coming back. How do we identify that, right? Is that something that is also a little bit elusive? Perhaps an easier thing to identify, something that really appears all over the Pirkei Nechama of Yeshayahu in some of the most magnificent prophecies is the return of Am Yisrael, the Kibbutz Galiot. I mean, it's just such an important theme. Obviously, you can have Geulah without people coming back, right? But of course, what happens if people don't come back, right? Because the Yeshayahu is preparing Yerushalayim for the return of the people. I brought for you just a couple of examples. Look in source number 10. Yeshayahu says, Al tira, don't be afraid. Ki itcha ani, I'm with you. He's talking to the people. God is speaking to the people. Mimizrach avi zarecha, umimarav akabetzcha, right? Akabtzecha, right? I'm going to bring your children back from the west. I'm going to bring them back from the east. Omar letzafon tani, I'm going to say to the north, give them to me. Uleteman al tichla, I'm going to say to the south, don't keep them there, right? Aviva na'nerachok uvnotai miktzaaretz. Bring me my children back. And then there are some really wonderful nivuot. For example, in Yeshayahu Memtet, I would look there. I brought it for you, but we're not going to read it together. I'll just tell you what number it is. It's in source 14. There's a wonderful nivuah there of all of the children of God promising Yerushalayim that all of her children are going to come back. And Yerushalayim has been sitting empty. Right? That's a city that's sitting lonely and alone. And God says, you're not going to be lonely anymore. It's going to be so crowded in Yerushalayim that you are going to say, Sarli hamakom gishali ve'esheva, which I think some of you may have heard me say before. That's my morning mantra in traffic. Right? I say, it's our bracha, right? You're going to say, Yerushalayim, move aside a little bit. This place has gotten a little crowded for me. So that's our bracha, right? So we have these wonderful images of people coming back to Yerushalayim, of the children coming back to Yerushalayim, Yeshayahu and Zechariah. Both of them say Yerushalayim is going to have to expand. That's what we're going to say tomorrow, right? In the Hoshana. Widen your tent. Pick up the tent pins and widen it, right? You can't stay in the old city much longer. You're going to have to build Nachalat Shiva. And you're going to have to build Mishkanot Shananit. And you're going to have to build Har Choma and Ramot and Har Chima. And you know what Zechariah says in Perek Bet? If you look in Zechariah in source number 12, Vayomer elav roots the barrel and Allah. So he says to Zechariah, go speak to that boy and say to him, Prazot Teshev Yerushalayim. You're not going to build Yerushalayim with a wall, because Zechariah wants to build Yerushalayim with a wall. You can't build Yerushalayim with a wall. You have to leave it open. Because there's going to be so many people, and shall I say cars? Right? It says behema, I mean cars, right? Someone just told me this week that when I made Aliyah, which was, let's say, almost 30 years ago at this point, there were 250,000 cars on the road. Okay, today I think there's something like 9 million, right? Okay. Meirov Adam ubehema, right? Because there are just so many cars, right? So the idea is that Yerushalayim is going to just be this ever expanding city, right? And that's part of the description here. I will say though that all of this, I think, is really leading to the main idea of Geula, which we find a lot in Yeshayahu. We also see it in Zechariah. And that is that the ultimate goal, as I said before, of this extraordinary movement back to Yerushalayim is that we should see the presence of God. How do we see the presence of God? Through the extraordinary events. The goal of salvation is to make evident God's intervention so that everyone will recognize God, and it will be amazing. The world will be astonished. Mishama kaila. Who ever heard of this kind of thing? Look at source number 13. Zechariah, Perek Chet. Kol Marashem Tzvot. Yipalei be'einei she'erit ha'am hazeh b'yamim ha'em. This will be amazing in the eyes of the world. Or might be a question. You think I'm amazed by it? I know I can do this, right? Or it's even amazing in mine. God could make an 89-year-old woman and a 99-year-old man give birth, right? That's the Sarah and Abraham illusion, right? But the events will leave people open mouthed, amazed. We have it in source number 14 in Yeshayahu Parak Mem Tet, right after the children start to come home. Look in Pasuk Kaf Aleph. Yerushalayim is going to say that Amart Bilvavech. Yerushalayim will say in her heart, Mi Alavli et Elah. Who birthed all these children for me? I'm the mother, says Yerushalayim. But I left it all alone. I thought they were all dead. These children, who raised them? I've been all alone. Where they come from? Right? That's Yerushalayim's response. We have Am Yisrael's response. Right? That's what we say in Hallel, which is a response to Geulah, right? We are meant to be amazed. And of course, more than anyone else, I think, the world is meant to be amazed, right? B'shuv Hashem et Zion hayinu kecholmim, az yomru v'goyim, higdil Hashem la'asot im eleh. Then the nations will say, God has done this great thing with these people, right? And of course, this will lead to some of the other goals of Geulah, like peace, because the nations will be subdued, like the idea that we have both in Zechariah in source number 15 and in Yeshayahu in source number 16, which we won't read for lack of time, that the nations will join Am Yisrael to serve God. That's the famous pasuk V'aviotim al har kodshi v'simachtim b'veit tfilati ki veiti beit tfilah yikarei l'chol ha'amim. Right? Everybody will serve God, and ultimately this leads to Malach Elohai. Right? The idea of Hamlachat Hashem, the coronation of God. This is how God is coronated, by everybody looking around and saying, "What just happened here? How did this happen?" This was a nation that was destroyed. This was a nation that had suffered terrible loss. How did they regroup? How did they reanimate? How did they come back and rebuild? That's the Hamlachat Hashem. And the Hamlachat Hashem we have not only in Yeshayahu, but of course one of the most famous psukim in Sefer Zechariah, which appears at the end in source number 18. Al kol haaretz vayom ha'hu Hashem echad u'shmo echad. Right? When will God be melech al kol haaretz? When Shivat Zion fulfills its goals. And yet, of course, and here's the downer part of the evening, and I'm going to start to bring this to a close. Right? It doesn't transpire in a smooth way. Right? It's messy. Shivat Zion is messy. Yeshayahu describes setbacks and difficulties, problems. Am Yisrael doesn't come back en masse from Babel, and even those who do return don't seem particularly or fully committed, not to rebuilding the Beit HaMikdash and not to serving God. As we said before, intermarriage is a terrible problem. Nehemiah is going to end with the problem of Shmirat Shabbat. It's actually a really ironic ending because, of course, Nehemiah's entire goal, or his most important goal, is to rebuild the walls around Yerushalayim. And suddenly, in Nehemiah Perek Gimel, the very end of Nehemiah, he says, "Wait a second, we rebuilt these walls, and you have these great, wonderful gates that we've rebuilt, and now you're opening them to do business on Shabbat? Do you not know that in Yirmiyahu Perek Zion, Yirmiyahu says that's why the city was burned? What has happened here, right? They're not keeping Shabbat. They're not keeping mitzvot ben adam l'chavero. Intermarriage is rampant. And of course, there are reasons for it, right? The temple never really becomes, the Beit HaMikdash never really becomes as glorious as the first. There are terrible security issues that we talked about. There are terrible economic issues. Leadership doesn't take off exactly, right? Certainly, we don't restore a Davidic king. There's not even autonomy, really, right? Where we do have a certain degree of independence, but everything is under the auspices of the Persian Empire. Even the dates that I talked about in Chagai and Zechariah, everything is dated to the Persian king, right? And so, things don't exactly go in the direction. And I think, more to the point is that Am Yisrael, as I said before, is far from certain that this is Geulah. And they had prophets, right? They're far from certain that this is Geulah. We hear it echoing over and over and over throughout, certainly in Yeshayahu, right? But even in this section I brought for you in Shir, which we're not going to look at, right? The section that the Rav Soloveitchik famously applies to our period, Ani Yeshena, the Libi air, right? We have this woman who is partially asleep, but her heart is awake, and she hears her beloved knocking on the door, right? And Pitchili Achoti Yonati Rayonati Sherashini Latal Kutotai Risise Laila. The dove says, "Let me in," and she says, "Well, Hashati it Kutanti Echacha El Hashem. I took off my clothes already. You want me to get redressed again? I'm fine now. I'm comfortable. Rachatzi Ragai Echacha Tamfen. I've washed my feet already, right?" And famously, the Rav rebukes American Jewry for not making Aliyah based on that. But actually, the Parshanim here talk about Shivat Zion. If you look at the Ibn Ezra, which we're not going to look at together, but if you look at the Ibn Ezra, you have it right here in source 21. He says it's talking about Shivat Zion. The people had not responded to Geulah. This passage makes it sound like laziness. I think we have other passages that suggest something else. There's a passage in Yeshayahu in which people say, I don't know if God is really looking at me anymore, right? Nistarad darki be'Hashem. I don't always see God as evident in my daily existence. And besides, we just went through a terrible Churban. And of course, then there's the problem of Cyrus, right? The pagan king, right? The redemption that takes place is set in motion by a pagan king. This is why Yeshayahu names Koresh twice in source number 22. And Koresh says, and Yeshayahu says, look at the end of line 1 in Pasuk Aleph of Perek Lamei. Ko'amar Hashem l'mishicho l'Koresh. Koresh is called the Mashiach, right? You're looking for a Mashiach? Koresh is called Mashiach. What's a Mashiach? It's an anointed. God says, I anointed Koresh. To what end did I anoint Koresh? Says the prophet here in the name of God. I anointed him so he could bring you back from Bavel. I anointed him so he could destroy Bavel, so he could destroy your enemies, so he could restore justice in the world. And yet, of course, it's a hard pill to swallow, right? The people are really concerned about this pagan entity sending them back to restart Geulah. And so Shivat Zion doesn't end up being the glorious period that it could have been. It has some good moments. We mentioned some of those good moments, right? They do rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. They do rebuild the walls. They do try to repopulate Yerushalayim. There is a period, a short, good period of Hashmonaim autonomy. And then it becomes a bad period of Hashmonaim autonomy, right? And then everything is destroyed. But, the period of Shivat Zion in the Tanakh ends badly. Not just because Nehemiah ends badly. I mentioned that, right? Nehemiah does not end with great hopes. But also because Malachi, remember I mentioned that Malachi is quite a bit later than Haggai and Zechariah? Malachi describes a failed Mikdash. So it's very nice that you rebuild the Beit HaMikdash, but if you're not serving God in it, then what do I need a Mikdash for? And so Malachi ends with the possibility of, not just the possibility, the prospect of Galut, of another exile on the horizon. And that's why it ends with a new herald. Hine anochi sholeach lachem et Iryah Hanavi. And so what do we do with all those prophecies? The one that I started with in Haggai, the prophecy that this is going to be a period of great transformation and of great dramatic change in the world. What do we do with our Hoshana Rabbah prophecy, right? So several of the Parshanim say that just as when prophets prophesy bad tidings and you do tshuva, they're not going to come true. Well, the same is true when prophets prophesy good tidings and they're contingent upon your behavior, they don't come true, right? But say these Parshanim, but these prophecies are put in abeyance for the right time. Look at the Ibn Ezra in verse 24. He quotes Rabbi Moshe Ibn Jakatila that says that prophecy in Haggai was al t'nai. It was contingent. It wasn't something that was promised that would definitely happen. It would happen if you responded to Geulah properly. If you came back and you rebuilt and you reconstituted your relationship with God. And look at what the Malbim says. We can't end without this Malbim. Look at this Malbim. Malbim says, "Lefize kol ma'amar zehu t'nai." This entire prophecy is al t'nai. It's dependent on people's behavior. Im yavo od ruach echad vehu im ya'asu et hadavar asher kara b'mam b'tzeitam mitzrayim. If you want God's ruach to come back, you have to keep the breath that He made with you when you came out of Egypt. And when that condition was not kept, why not? Look at how the Malbim describes the period of Shivat Zion. They didn't keep the covenant. There was no peace. Because the booze increased, the hakitot and the fractions, the sinat chinam, and senseless hatred. Lo nitkayem hayuda az. The goals were not fulfilled. Ad sheyibaneh habayit acharon v'ketz acharon she'az yitkaymu hayudim ha'ela. Right. So Malbim says it's okay. We're gonna make it there. Right. Shivat Zion, I think, is an incredibly important period in Am Yisrael's history. I think that even if it didn't succeed in fulfilling its fullest potential, it leaves us both with a deep impression and a significant lesson about two things: God and Am Yisrael. Right? God's might, God's will, and Am Yisrael's responsibility. There is the story of the return of Am Yisrael to Israel following the Korban teaches us Hayipalei meHashem davar. Is anything too wondrous for God? God can and did and will again revive a desiccated nation. God can and did and will again reunify a scattered people. God can rebuild an abandoned city and can reconstitute a shattered dream. And all of that are things that we learn from Shivat Zion. But it also teaches us that even when there's a period of great hope and great potential, there are always going to be obstacles and struggles and setbacks and possibility for failure because we are humans. And ultimately, the success of Geulah revolves not around God's will, but around the will of humans. The willingness of Am Yisrael to respond to historical events, and the willingness of Am Yisrael to avoid those things that Malbim said led to the failure of Shivat Zion. Sinat Chinam, societal fracture, allowing the troublemakers to prevail. It's our task, I think, to Simu levavchem al darchechem. That's a quote that we have several times in the Shivat Zion prophets. To pay attention and recognize what's going on around us, and both to celebrate the miracles of what has happened, but also to put our shoulder to the grindstone, right? And do the hard work of ensuring that we deserve these miracles and that we merit to continue to experience God's presence among us. And finally, as we struggle along in our lives, trying to hear the Kol-Hamevasser, Mevaser Ve'omer, hoping that we can respond appropriately to whatever events are going on around us, we continue every day, 3 times a day, to daven the Tefillah Ha'amidah, right? The Shemona Esrei. The Shemona Esrei is a prayer for the Geulah that we talked about tonight. The Geulah envisioned by the prophets. We daven for Kibbutz Galion. We daven for Stakar Mishpat. We daven for Tzemach from Beit David, who will succeed in being a virtuous and unifying leader. We daven for a rebuilt Yerushalayim. We daven for peace, and we daven for Hamlachat Hashem. Umlo Aleinu Ata Hashem V'Cham B'Chesed U'Barachamim. Amen. King Yiratzon.